Well, guys, if you thought Russia was considering negotiating, I think you're going to have to think again. They've attacked across just about every location they've shown any interest in trying to seize and are firmly rejecting Biden's terms for talks. Let's break it all down. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is December 2nd, 2022. This is your daily Ukraine update. Okay, when we look at the map, you guys can see that Russia has made clear their operational priorities are, of course, here in the east. This makes perfect sense as the southern front near Kherson, of course, they've withdrawn from. They've put a lot of time and effort into fortifying the regions around Crimea. But in some ways, it sort of feels like Russia is less concerned with retaining this southern territory, and that makes a lot of sense. Geopolitically, Russia, I think, has a larger incentive to protect its border, its land borders. It always has for, 200 years. And so having Luhansk Oblast and Donetsk Oblast secured are operational priorities for the regime. It's also true that, remember, when this invasion happened, the original designs involved regime change in Kiev. But then when they scaled back their goals, it became the independence of Luhansk and Donetsk Oblasts. Kherson and Zaporizhzhia were just seen as being of secondary importance. And so I think you're going to see Russia sort of possibly either accept that this is going to be just taken whole territory and possibly even engage in a fighting retreat, right? Making Ukrainian forces do these dangerous river crossings. And they're hoping, I imagine, to force the Ukrainians to expend considerable manpower to liberate these regions. And again, it sort of makes sense because my understanding is that these are also more pro-Ukrainian, whereas there's at least a contingent of pro-Russian forces that have been operating in the Donbass for some time. But all that to say, you guys can see very clearly there's a couple of operational priorities for the Russian armed forces. It seems like one is the encirclement of Avdiivka. And you can see that by the way that they are trying to push out and create this southern prong of encirclement. And they realize, I think, that there's not enough intervening. The terrain is not favorable to encirclement here in Avdiivka. You can see this river is it might become a natural barrier to a southern prong, but it's also become a barrier to encirclement. You could see how open the fields are here, and it would be very hard to cross open fields, especially in winter when there's no foliage to provide concealment, and seize all of these individual villages, all of which can quickly become Ukrainian strong points if they aren't already. So I think they're trying to expand outward, possibly to, again, give some further security to Donetsk. And as we talked about, I think the larger objective is to get this airport secured. Right now, obviously, they hold the territory of the airport, but you guys can see that it's very, very close. It's within probably 2 kilometers of the front line. And that's just not, you cannot safely have aircraft land, take off, and taxi. They would need to at least seize Avdiivka in order to facilitate that, right? We've seen in other videos, 5 to 10 kilometers is kind of the range that they want to have around their airport to bring it up to operational levels. So when we sort of facilitate that, of course, they're launching all these attacks along the south. When we look to the north, of course, we've talked a little bit about Bakhmut. Recent video has surfaced in which Ukrainian forces defending Bakhmut have actually said there's been a significant number of mobilized Russian troops in addition to Wagner mercenaries, which I find interesting that the Russian Ministry of Defense would actually choose to give Prigozhin additional manpower to achieve his objectives. It speaks possibly to some sort of regulatory capture, that somehow Prigozhin has his people funneling mobilized conscripts despite the Ministry of Defense's desire to see them fight elsewhere. It's also possible that Putin himself has said Bakhmut is the priority. That just I can't really come up with another explanation as to why the Ministry of Defense would put so much effort into bolstering a group supported by a man who has actively campaigned and literally tried to create his own Ministry of Defense, right? This is like FedEx helping UPS deliver packages for free. It makes no sense whatsoever. But as you can see, the goal of encircling Bakhmut, even some Russian sources have become explicit that this is the goal, to create a level of encirclement. There's some problems with this too. One is that encircling multiple strong points is really hard. So as we've talked about, Bakhmut itself is densely defended with Ukrainian forces. We've seen video where almost every intersection has tank traps, defensive positions just abound, and it seems like every inch of the city that Russian forces take, they're going to find themselves fighting dug in Ukrainian forces. The other problem, the larger problem, is that encircling it would necessarily put you up against this Chasiv Yar. And you can see that if you were to try to encircle Bakhmut without taking Chasiv Yar, you would put yourself actually in an absolutely horrendous position. You'd be pressed up against this river. You would have Ukrainian forces from Bakhmut firing west and Ukrainian forces in Chasiv Yar firing east. And you would have these forces be badly, badly exposed. So the most I'd say they can hope for, and you can see this part of the southern prong is so wide open. And as winter falls, this tree cover is not going to provide any concealment. So I'm not really sure how much further they can advance beyond Klitschivka without absolutely getting just crushed by the Ukrainians, who almost certainly know this and have almost certainly reinforced each one of these cities in an effort to create a sort of networked strong point defense. I can only imagine the level of pre-placed TRPs, target reference points, that artillery are just sitting here, just waiting. Every one of these intersections is probably just, the coordinates are just pre-entered. They're just waiting for the Russians to be dumb enough to try it. You know, we can also see that they may be choosing to try to take Bakhmut. You can see here, right at the outskirts of the city, there have been some attacks. Again, I think this also is just so favorable to the Ukrainian forces, right? Losing Bakhmut is not operationally significant for the Ukrainians. It's not essential to their efforts. And the Russians are extremely fixated on this, even though it's not particularly significant. And so I think the Ukrainians will just make them pay a vicious, brutal price as they fight their way out of Bakhmut, just burning newly conscripted soldiers and making it just as hellacious as possible. Because as we've seen, the PR effects of more and more Russian mothers losing their sons is considerable. And it's not a secret that the level of frustration is rising within Russia. And so it is actually strategically beneficial for Russia or for Ukraine to inflict maximum casualties. It's not usually the case, right? Usually inflicting casualties is of secondary importance to achieving your military objectives. But in this instance, where it's clear that Russia knows that it needs to maintain popular support and that it's failing to do so, creating meaningless meat grinders in which many Russian sons won't return is actually a strategic objective. And I think Bakhmut is quickly turning into that. When we look to the north, we can see here Russia continues to attempt to seize Bilohorivka. It's trying to be a little more strategic. You can see attacking across this river in the north is an effective tactic because they may be trying to cut this town off from support, but it's really hard to do. As you guys can see, launching an attack like this requires conducting a river crossing of some significance, and that can be time consuming and really hard to do at scale. And so while you can get, a platoon, 30 people across relatively quickly, turning that into an offensive of several thousand troops is almost impossible, especially if Ukrainian forces have done things like blown these bridges, which I imagine they have, simply because if they're going to turn this territory near Crimea, well, they're going to do it along this giant line of contact where there's not really any natural barriers. So we could see that, Russian forces also engaging in other villages along this tremendously long line of contact, especially in this region where, as we've talked about, both sides are really dug in and contesting. One thing that I think is worth noting is that what's not clear from this map is the volume of fighting, right? These instances could be two 8-man squads encountering each other. This could be platoons, and these could be battalions of thousands. It's tough to know, right? Fighting is not all equal. And so, there's a principle in the military called concentration or mass, and this is the idea that you concentrate your forces as best you can in the places where they are most needed, right? In the decisive time and place. And obviously, Ukrainian artillery has done a phenomenal job of preventing Russia from achieving concentration and mass, right? They forced them to break up their large formations. And so that's why their attacks look like this instead of a single giant thrust of an entire battalion of conscripts running at Ukrainians. But if you you still have to deploy your troops in a concentration that makes sense. And you can see Russia's trying to concentrate their forces near Bakhmut, and in turn, Ukraine has to concentrate their forces on the defense of Bakhmut, right? And so it's tough to know where the forces are deployed necessarily. Still, I think this is a really good insight into Russia's ground strategy. But what's also interesting, we pivot over to ground news, also, as always, a great source in this conflict. The link is in the description. You should check them out for free. The Kremlin rejected U.S. President Joe Biden's terms for Ukraine talks. This is not peace terms themselves. These are conditions to start peace talks. And you can see this is covered actually across the board, even by Russian government sources like RT, which I find pretty fascinating. I'd kind of like to see how RT covers this. I just want to make sure, since sometimes my email pulls up. Interesting. Biden's terms for peace talks unacceptable. Kremlin. Okay. Russia will not withdraw troops from Ukraine before starting negotiations. Right. President Joe Biden demanded that talks will only be possible after Putin leaves Ukraine, something that Moscow will not accept. This is interesting. And their answer is that the special military operation continues. That said, President Putin is, and will be open to contacts for talks. Certainly, the preferred path for securing our interest is peaceful diplomacy. Right. In a joint press conference with Macron, Biden said, I'm prepared to speak with Mr. Putin if, in fact, there's an interest in him deciding he's looking for a way to end the war. He hasn't done that yet. Biden said the only way for this war to end is the rational way, Putin to pull out of Ukraine. So this is interesting that even RT agrees that this is the perspective of the Russian government, that they just cannot abide by these terms. But the important thing is that these negotiations have started, and this is sort of how the process works, right? The early in peace talks, right, you have stuff like this where there's oftentimes wrangling over specifics of what talks look like. And right now, these people are staking out their positions, right? And it's like any good negotiation, right? One side says, oh, we have this extreme version of our position, and the other side, like, here's the most extreme version of ours. Both sides know that over time, they're going to meet in the middle somewhere. But the question is, where. And that's why there's an incentive for both sides, right? You don't want one side to take the extreme position. You take kind of this reasonable one. And so when you meet in the middle, you actually get this a position that favors the extremist. Anyway, guys, that is all I had for you for this morning. I know that was a lot, but it's really interesting stuff to see. And I think that things are only going to get more intense as winter falls. Anyway, as always, if you want access to the uncensored combat videos, you know the viral ones I'm talking about, I break all of those down on the Patreon. Thanks so much to my Lieutenant Tier patrons. This week's Patreon video is dropping today, so be sure to sign up, check it out. I'll see you all in the next one.